And we are back on the Build Phase podcast. I'm your host, Mr. Ben, and today we are going to talk about another new IP that has been revealed for Versus. But before I do that, I want to say thank you to all of my patrons, and I want to specifically shout out Brad, Jason, Justin, Patrick, Peter, Roland, and Patrick for their support of the show. If you like what we're doing here, patreon.com/thebuildphase, you can join the coolest clubhouse in Versus. So the new IP. Yesterday we got The Boys. I spent some time speculating about maybe the game moving in a more adult direction. Our demographic tends a little bit older, so giving people things, targeting the game at an older audience kind of makes sense. The Boys sort of pushed us in that direction. And today's reveal underlines that direction, and that is Mortal Kombat. Holy smokes. Never in a million years would I have thought we were going to get Mortal Kombat in the game. Now, the only thing that we have kind of revealing this is the participation playmat at the World Championship this year is Raiden. And confront the first things first. It is a video game image of Raiden. So it's not from a Mortal Kombat comic book. It's not from one of the Mortal Kombat movies. So we have a computer graphic image, and what we have been told, what I've heard, secondhand, of course, I'm not at Gen Con, is that the Mortal Kombat cards will slot into the photographic universe. So no animated series, no animated universe, but it does seem that photo is starting to bleed. It's not just actual photographs. This is going to be stills from a video game, which is a little bit fundamentally different than a photograph, but it is what it is. It's going to be in photographic universe. So Mortal Kombat. I remember when the first Mortal Kombat came out and the moral outrage that tore through my small town. I remember renting the game cartridge from the video store that I rode to on my bicycle and then hiding it from my parents until after they went to bed so I could play this just for a few hours at night after they were asleep. I have very, very fond memories of specifically Mortal Kombat 1, 2, and 3. Those were the three that were out when I was kind of in that middle school into high school age range when video arcades were still a thing everywhere. And I really enjoyed it. The thing about Mortal Kombat as an IP is it fits so seamlessly into the Versus universe. Our whole game is about taking, two main characters with a supporting cast of characters and getting them into a fight. And Mortal Kombat has a massive and diverse roster of characters that we could potentially choose from. So that fits really well. One of the criticisms, or that's the wrong word. One of the problems a property like Firefly would have in translating to Versus is there just aren't enough characters to fill out a curve. Mortal Kombat is not going to have that problem. Now, there's a few things I have to get out kind of up front here. I need to have a Johnny Cage crotch punch. If I don't have a split punch, either on the Johnny Cage card or a plot twist, if there's no crotch punch from Johnny Cage, it's not Mortal Kombat. And similarly, we gotta have a card called Get Over Here, right? I want to be able to play Scorpion and say, okay, I'm going to activate Get Over Here. If we can't hit those notes, then what are we even doing this for? So I'm sure there's lots of other... Sub-Zero freezing somebody, of course, is another one of those notes that they absolutely have to hit. Now, there has been some chatter. I don't remember which Discord I read it in or who said it, but so apologies if I'm taking words out of somebody's mouth and not properly sourcing it. But so I saw somebody talking about fatalities, and I think that's really interesting because a fatality in Mortal Kombat is really part of sort of the core identity of it. The thing that people got really mad about 100 years ago, back in the 90s when Mortal Kombat came out, was Kano ripping the heart out of a dude's chest, Sub-Zero ripping the spine out of a person's body. To a lesser degree, Scorpion burning people while they were beat to the point of being unable to defend themselves, but nonetheless burning people alive. So there are... Having hyper gory, over the top ways to kill your opponent is a core part of what makes Mortal Kombat Mortal Kombat. How does that translate to versus? Could fatalities be like one of a kind plot twists that you can only play if you control the character of the specific name, and it does some over the top thing, like a character with one remaining health uh, doesn't have remaining, it takes only target a character with one remaining health, wound that character, something to that effect. I mean, there would have to be more to it than that. But then at that point, we start to look at, well, how unbalanced is this? We've gone through a year or so of kind of complaining about, maybe complaining is too strong a word, but observing the fact that the healing in versus is starting to get out of control. There's so many tuck and pass main characters, as well as support for those types of strategies. And on top of that, now it's not just tuck and pass, it's actual wound removal, actual healing. So if Mortal Kombat comes out and kind of fills the role of adding lethal to characters or accelerating wounds against main characters and essentially acts as the foil to the deep water of infinite health that we've been swimming in these last couple years, that could be a really cool role for that IP to play. And there's so many layers to this. So on the one layer, mechanically, it's something the game probably is going to need soon. For the life of Versus, we haven't had a lot of healing. We haven't had a lot of wound reduction, wound removal. These types of effects have been not non-existent, but very judiciously parceled out by Super Awesome Games. Kind of like Search. That's another thing we haven't had a lot of. They've been very careful to try to keep the game within these a fairly narrow range of error bars. Now, it hasn't always been successful. There's been some cards that have broken the balance here and there over the years, but the general point that I'm driving at is most of the game's life, there hasn't been much of this healing type of effect or wound soaking, wound prevention type of effects have been pretty sparse. And then they gave us a bunch of sets in a row that have these types of effects in them. Maybe not in a row, that's a little strong. But over a few years, we got a bunch of effects that prevent wounds, heal wounds, and now maybe it feels like we're sort of tipping into the other direction. So mechanically speaking, having a Mortal Kombat set comes out that has plot twists that can accelerate wounds, ways to just straight up kill people, a character with one remaining health. I could see a plot twist called Fatality, KO a character with one remaining health, something to that effect. That would fit pretty well with Mortal Kombat as a theme, and it would fit with kind of the place where the game is getting to mechanically, where I think we're going to need some ways to deal with how ridiculous the healing has started to get, which is the nature of card games. I like that let me be clear, it is not a criticism to say that we got a lot of healing effects and that maybe the scale is starting to tip a little too far in that direction. That's fine. Part of what's fun about being involved in a living card game, trademark, being involved in a card game for which there are still expansions being released, is that you get to see different phases of the game, different stages of the game's life cycle. And we've gone through a life cycle with Versus now where there's been a ton of additional healing. That's fine, cool, to a point. Eventually we're all going to get tired of games that go super, super, super long where nobody can get killed. So then the Upper Deck or Super Awesome, whoever it is that, is kind of piloting the ship, they decide, okay, we're going to release some game mechanics that fall into this other space that maybe not direct answer, maybe some of them are direct answers, but encouraging different play patterns that sort of pull us away from whatever the dominant slash suffocating prevailing mechanics are within the meta. This is all fine. This is well and good. Because it keeps the game interesting. It keeps us doing different things. It has us solving different problems. It has us complaining about different stuff. And yes, it's true that there will always be things to be critical of and complain. I mean, on some level, if I take away the complaining from this podcast, then it's just going to be me cheerleading every Versus set. And that's less interesting, although I'm okay to wear the cheerleader hat every now and again as well. So mechanically speaking, I think Mortal Kombat would now, we don't know when this set's going to come out. We don't know when the boys are going to come out. I'm not sure which set was intended for which year, or any of those details are still kind of vague. But if what is happening is we're going to get some Mortal Kombat cards that have these crazy fatality and like lethal everywhere type effects on them. I think that's probably healthy for the game. I think it is excellent thematically for the IP. And think about what this would do for the new player experience, specifically the player who's coming from the Mortal Kombat world. So we get a bunch of these fighting game guys, fighting game people come to our game with this attitude of, or maybe that's the wrong word, but a preconceived notion. It's not an attitude. It's a preconceived notion about what playing Mortal Kombat is like. It's a fight to the death. So giving them a product, when they tear it open, there's a bunch of cards that let them straight up kill character, KO this character, do extra damage to this MC. That would sort of meet the expectations of the Mortal Kombat player where they're at, as well as being something that's good for the overall health of the game at this particular moment in Versus. Now, certainly I can understand that if we go too far and there's too much removal and there's too many ways to like kill people faster, we've lived in metas in Versus where aggro was out of control too. So there is, as always, a balance in how Super Awesome Games negotiates these different mechanics, these different power levels. Generally speaking, while I totally concede that there are bad ways to do these things, I have a lot of faith in Danny and Ben. They have an excellent track record for putting together a card game that is engaging and interesting and fun and deep and nuanced, but still casual friendly enough that you can play it at your kitchen table and get a lot out of it and have a lot of fun. I see no reason to think Mortal Kombat is going to be where they're going to stumble. So to me, this is all good news. Now, while I did say previously that I have a lot of fond memories of Mortal Kombat, I'm talking about memories from 20 years ago, 25 years ago. I have not played Mortal Kombat recently. I was aware when Mortal Kombat X came out, which I think was the 10th one. Oh yeah, duh, at Roman numeral 10. So that was a few years ago. It was in the before times, therefore I of course can't remember specifically when it was. But that was the last Mortal Kombat game that actually crossed my radar, that I was aware of when it was new and hot. So the gap between whenever Mortal Kombat 3 came out and Mortal Kombat, that's how long I haven't been paying attention. So I think it's fair to say that at best I am a casual Mortal Kombat fan or a lapsed Mortal Kombat fan. I am not hardcore. I'm not a hardcore fighting game fan in general, although there have been periods of my life where I've gotten pretty serious about that too. I like fighting games. I enjoy watching other people play fighting games. I'm saying all this to just kind of lay out my bias, because I'm sure there's some people who are going to look at the last two reveals over the last couple days, the boys in Mortal Kombat, and go, I don't know if this is the direction I want Versus to head. And frankly, those people they're entitled to their opinion. They might have a point. We've spent a lot of years playing a game that's dripping with theme, very tongue-in-cheek, downright silly at times. There's a lot of childlike elements in how Versus cards are handled, how the things are written on the cards. There's a lot of silliness in that. And while silly doesn't necessarily equal childish, they kind of dovetail a little bit. So I think a person, and again, I am not this person, but I think a person who looks at this and has a serious moment of reflection going, is Versus going to be the game for me going forward? Like, if I'm not into gore and I don't like the kind of gritty, ugly reality that the boys paints, and I'm not into the kind of gritty, hyper violent. I mean, honestly, I think Mortal Kombat is so violent, it's comedy. But that's not everybody. So imagine a player for whom maybe they play with their kids, like I play with my kids, and I'm not sure I'm going to be able to show my kids these sets. Somebody pointed out that they're marked 17, the boys ad is marked 17 plus, which is another indication that maybe the game is going to be moving in a more mature, more adult direction. Personally, I think that's great. I think we could see actual more growth in the game by focusing content on the demographic that is most widely represented within Versus players already. So maybe the strategy is, instead of having the big tent Marvel license trying to get in as many people of all different ages as possible, they being Upper Deck or Super Awesome Games, some combination thereof, they've instead decided to really drill down and try to provide things that are catered to the attitudes of the aging nerd. You know, the kind of people who like really violent comic books, kind of people who like really out there shows. This is not the same. Now, and I get, I'm going on this kind of tangent about how the game is moving in a more adult direction, and it cannot be ignored that Aliens is a very mature property, and that was the fourth set ever, the third expansion for the game. So we had base set, A-Force, Defenders, Aliens. So the game does have baked into the first year of its existence, the existence of these more mature licenses. So this can't come as a total shock. But again, I can imagine a Versus player who got into it for Marvel, maybe is a fan of Buffy, and has avoided like Predator or some of these more really Aliens and Predator, the two that are the violent, more mature properties that we have within Versus. X-Files and Buffy, I think, are a tier below Alien and Predator, although there's mature content in both of those as well. And frankly, some of the MCU films, you know, I'm old enough to remember when it was like the end of the world in the Natural Born Killers Oliver Stone film when they showed an image of Robert Downey Jr.'s hand with a hole shot through it, and you could see through the hole. And that was like, this movie has to be rated NC-17. And now, like in the first Thor movie, he flies with his hammer through a monster's head, and you see through the head of the monster. So times have changed. And some of that is, I'm an old man now. Like it's harder and harder for me to gauge exactly what the standards are now, like exactly what's appropriate for kids these days, so to speak. You know, I feel equipped to make those kinds of decisions for my own children, but I certainly would not look down my nose at somebody else who was like, oh, I don't want my kids playing with Predator cards. You know, okay, sure, that's valid. I allow my kids to play with my Predator cards, but I don't want to begrudge anybody else. This is all a super long walk way of saying, I think the kind of player who looks at The Boys and Mortal Kombat and then says, I'm not sure if Versus is long term going to be for me. I think that's probably valid. And I think that player, I would encourage them not to check out yet, because while we do have this kind of dense reveal of these two hyper violent, extremely adult oriented IPs, the overall thrust of Versus over many years now has been kind of silly, family friendly, Marvel style entertainment. So I just don't want any of the chicken little that's dismissive. That's not fair. I think it's way too soon. It's way premature for anybody to be pulling the handbrake and going, oh, I don't know if Versus is going to work out for me on the basis of these properties. I understand somebody being a little wary. You know, I myself am not sure that I'm going to be able to share the Boys expansion with my 11-year-old. I'm just not sure. Maybe we will. Maybe we'll get cards that all have, sanitize isn't the word I want to use, but it's kind of a shorthand, that have, you know, like PG rated art while maybe alluding to some of the more serious topics. Basically like what they did with Predator. You know, there's a couple of Predator cards, like the one where he's getting his hands chopped off. That's pretty violent. And of course, soup happens. The language is pushed a little there, but outside of I guess Death Trap's a little violent too, but outside of those couple of cards, the rest of the Predator set is just people with guns, aliens with weapons, and I don't think there's much to object there to. So I think it's possible that we could see both The Boys and Mortal Kombat handled in that same kind of way, where a lot of the more adult elements are sort of left to your imagination, they're left to your preconceived notions of what the IP is. But I would kind of also be okay with them just going for it. I mean, I'm repeating myself a little bit given what was said yesterday about The Boys, and I don't want to be a total broken record, but both of these IPs kind of push me into thinking about the same types of topics. You know, if the call that Upper Deck has made is that they are indeed going to try to serve the little bit older demographic that is the Versus player base, if they go hardcore mature and we get Love Sausage is a boy's character that's been brought up a number of times. If we get that kind of content in the game, it will. We can't deny that it will change what a versus event is like. Up until this point, I feel like the events have been pretty much all ages. Now, I know Upper Deck actually changed it to make it so the events are technically not all ages any longer. And perhaps that's part of this. Perhaps it's a totally separate thing. I have no inside information on that. Pushing the game in new directions, I think, is very healthy as long as we're doing it with our eyes open. Do we want versus events to be all ages friendly, or do we want to have versus events where maybe some of the content and the IPs that we're dealing with really aren't appropriate for children? Maybe a kid walking past the table could see some card images that you'd feel pretty bad showing to a kid. There's stuff in the boys that hits me as an adult I wouldn't want my kids to see. How much of that is going to make it to the game? I don't know. The same, of course, is true of Mortal Kombat. Again, I mentioned earlier that I think the violence is so egregious that it actually tips into comedy. That's my personal opinion. My mom would not agree with me about the humor of Kano ripping a person's heart out of their chest and then like holding it up. I wasn't allowed to watch Raiders of the Lost, or not Raiders, sorry, Temple of Doom when I was that age either. So it's hard for me to come down and have like a summary of my thoughts on this topic, on all of this. Overall, I'm excited for Mortal Kombat. I'll say that right there. Again, I'm not a huge fanboy, I am enough of a casual fan or lapsed fan that this announcement really hit me. But I was not only excited because of the IP itself, but because of like what it represents, like how deep this world is, and the boys as well. It's a very deep world with a lot of characters. Could these be expansions that we actually see followed up on? Mortal Kombat has more than enough characters to do a complete arc. So are we going to get a 200 card battle box and that's it? Could we see multiple expansion, a 200 plus 255s for some of these? I think the characters are there. Is it likely? Probably not. I'm just speculating. I'm thinking out loud here, of course. But this is good stuff. The Boys in particular is a really hot property. X-Files felt a little weird because it's so far past the sell-by date. That show was super hot in the 90s. The Boys is super hot right now, and Mortal Kombat has never really stopped being hot in the right kinds of circles. Now, if you're not an arcade fighting game aficionado, that might sound like, what do you mean Mortal Kombat has never stopped being hot? I haven't thought about it in years. Sure, it maybe in a niche sense. It has a cult following. That's a good way to think about it. And so does the X-Files, but not to the same degree. There aren't competitive tournaments around X-Files every year with the way that there are Mortal Kombat. So I think Mortal Kombat is better positioned to bring in more new players who have a competitive mindset. I think it's going to be really healthy for the competitive aspect of Versus to tap into the fighting game kind of mentality and hopefully bring some of those people with their attitudes towards competition, have some fresh blood for the hardcore players to bounce against. At a certain point, you look at the list of people who are playing at Gen Con this year, it's a lot of names we already know. This is kind of a weird year for Gen Con, the first year back, COVID, blah, blah, blah. But the idea of bringing in fresh blood and growing the game, I think is really, really exciting. I think both of these IPs stand a good chance of growing the game. And particularly, like I mentioned, Mortal Kombat, I think stands a good chance of bringing in competitive players, growing the competitive population of the game, which is really exciting to me as somebody who really enjoys the competitive nature of Versus. So I just have good stuff, just good news. I'm excited about all these announcements. I'm looking forward to it. I'm really curious what this means for the overall direction of the game, whether my speculation about Upper Deck moving in a more mature direction is correct, or if these are just kind of one-off sets and they're going to be handled in the kind of PG rated way that Aliens and Predator were. I just don't know. And not knowing, but having stuff to speculate about is so much more fun than not knowing and having nothing to talk about. So I appreciate Upper Deck finally getting this information out to us. the wound suffered by the community with this lengthy amount of silence and lengthy amount of time between expansions, it doesn't seem that bad in this moment because the game is actually doing pretty healthy. We are growing, but I think we could be doing so much more. And looking at what has been revealed at Gen Con, I think we are going to do so much more. It is a bright future for Versus fans, as far as I'm concerned. So, till next time, go win some games.